So I just want you to take a second just to ground in the moment. So just everybody just sit back in your chair and put your feet on the floor, your hands in your lap. Let me just see if I can see some of you here. There we go. So just get comfortable in your chair. And I want you to, if you feel comfortable enough, close your eyes or soften your gaze a little bit and just take a breath just for a moment. Nice long breath in and a nice long breath out. And I want you to just imagine a container, like a mason jar or a shoebox or Tupperware or treasure chest, storage container, something that has a lid or a door that will seal. And I want you to kind of expand that container with your thoughts. So what does it look like? Put your hands on it. What would it feel like? Does it have a smell to it? Is it old and dusty, or is it new and shiny? You know, that kind of a thing. I want you to imagine what it would sound like to open the lid or open the door to it. And I want you to put any worries or concerns or annoyances that you might have that might keep you from being present today, just put it in the container. And know that it's a nice, safe place to put those worries. You can come back to them later and take them out when you need to. And I want you to close the lid on your container and hear the sound of the lid closing. And then I want you to, in your head, I want you to put it away somewhere safe. So maybe in a cupboard or a closet or on a shelf somewhere, and just put that away. And I want you to take a nice, slow, deep breath. Bring your awareness to your breath. Let go of the tension in your shoulders. Let your tongue drop off the roof of your mouth. Relax into your seat and let go of the tension in your legs. And then I want you to open your eyes and come back into the room that you're in. And just look around and notice 5 things that you can see in the room around you. And notice 4 things that you can feel touching your body right now. So the seat underneath you, the floor under your feet, your clothes against your skin. And notice 3 things that you can hear around you. Traffic or wind or people. And just take a nice deep breath. Now, you might be wondering why I did that. Why would I start with a grounding exercise? We're going to talk about trauma. Trauma has a way of distorting our sense of our location in time. So we can get lost between past and present. When people have experienced a traumatic event, it's easy to get lost. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. One of the things to recognize is that trauma is a very unpleasant topic. You know, I think sometimes people come to trainings that I do on trauma thinking we're going to talk about car accidents, and yeah, that's part of it. But my experience with trauma is much deeper than that, and it's not pleasant to talk about. It's really unspeakably ugly. And our natural defense against atrocity is to simply evict it from our consciousness. But I always think that ignorance is a luxury that, you know, it's only afforded to the privileged in the world. The people that I work with, the traumatized clients that I work with, they don't have the luxury of ignorance. They know what's really up in the world. They have to be consciously aware of it all the time. And you need to know too, if for no other reason than to avoid doing more harm unintentionally. And I always say the responsibility for dealing with their symptoms really lies with us, the professionals, the people who are well. So we don't put the burden of change on victimized humans, right? It's a bit like expecting people in wheelchairs to build their own ramps. So we have to be grounded, and we have to be regulated, and we have to be flexible as service providers, as helpers. So that's our responsibility. And And, you know, I talk a lot about the capacity for evil in the human condition. I use a lot of real examples from the clients that I've had over the last 14 years. Sometimes that can be quite triggering. So if you are triggered by any information that I share, and being triggered is something occurring in the present moment that sparks a memory of a previous hurt that you've experienced, and it brings up the emotions, the thoughts, and the felt sense of what happened to you. If that happens, please bring your awareness to your thoughts, your feelings, your body sensations, maybe make notes about it if that's helpful. And really ground yourself in the present. That exercise that we just did of 5 things that you can see, 4 things that you can feel, 3 things that you can hear, is a way of grounding yourself in the present moment where you are safe, right? So when we get triggered by something, we get drawn back in time to a time when we were unsafe. You are safe right now. And so you need to be in the now if you're feeling triggered by that. And if you need to debrief after, I recommend that you do that. So with your mental health providers or close friend or family member or colleague, if you have an EAP or a spiritual mentor, just to make sure that you get to talk about that and your experience with being triggered in your own trauma. I don't recommend that you share it here. And I always say that when I do trainings, especially with professionals. Some of you may work together as colleagues, and it's not an appropriate place to share your trauma. Also, it could easily turn into a group therapy session, and I don't think that's what our intention is today. So please, if you do feel like you need some support afterwards, please do get that. So my agenda, and I'm going to flip through a little bit. I'm going to skip over a few things because we're limited for time. I want to give you the sort of most bang for your buck here. So I'm going to briefly describe trauma. We'll talk a little bit about the different types of trauma. But mostly I'm going to focus on the impacts of trauma. So the physical impacts, the psychological impacts, and impacts on memory, and mostly on behavior. I really would like to get to that. And then I'm going to talk quite a bit about like sort of what to do. That's how we're going to end. I always find, you know, I do a training on trauma, so I spend a lot of time talking about like all the bad things that people experience, and then it's really important, I think, that we know what to do with that at the end. So that's where I'm going to get to. So let me just hide everybody here so that we can see the slide. Okay. So what is trauma? Like, in order to be trauma informed, you have to be informed about trauma. So I'll give you a little bit of a crash course here. So trauma it's not in the event. The event itself is not trauma. It's traumatic, but it's not trauma. Trauma is in the nervous system. So it's a nervous system response to an event in the social environment that really overwhelms a person's ability to cope. It's inescapable. So there's nothing that the person could do to alter or evade what has happened to them. And it leaves people with this sense of powerlessness or helplessness. There's really no reprieve from it. The events are often profoundly negative and life-altering. It's often unexpected. People are caught off guard. They find themselves in a situation that they can't control, and they have no defense against it. Now, in spite of the devastation of the event, the person survives, right? If they didn't survive, they wouldn't be bothered by what happened. But the brain and the body had to employ automatic adaptive resources in order to endure what happened. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And this is an important point that I'm going to come back to. The nervous system's response was adaptive for the situation. Okay, so because of the overwhelming nature of the event, the brain isn't able to integrate the event into normal memory or consciousness, and the response becomes stuck and fragmented, and it kind of gets stuck on a bit of a loop. But in the moment, what the body and the brain had to do in order to survive was adaptive. So whether that's repressing the information or forgetting, or developing a heightened sense of sensitivity, I should say, to threat, becoming hypervigilant, right? All of these symptoms of PTSD that we're talking about, those were adaptive. There is some original wisdom in the response itself, because it kept the person alive. But they can't move forward. They can't compartmentalize. They can't get past it. They're not going to forget about it. They can't just shrug it off and get back to their regular life. They are essentially altered by the experience. And because the event is not integrated, there's no timestamp. So the physical and emotional and psychological responses exist outside of past and present, and they really become frozen in place with this event. So I'm not a fan of the designation of big T and little t traumas, because I think my problem with it is that it implies that little t traumas are of lesser importance or significance, and that's not true. But the DSM-5 likes the big T traumas because they're measurable and they're tangible. So big T traumas are those sort of life-threatening events. They either threaten our life or the life of a loved one, where, you know, that sort of life passing before your eyes, like that almost dying. So examples, obvious ones, are sort of motor vehicle accidents, surviving combat experiences, a serious assault where your life was in danger, or like natural disasters. I've worked with people who survived the tsunami in Indonesia. I think, when was that? Back in 2011, and they're profoundly impacted by having survived that event, obviously. So the little t traumas are more personal, and often occur in a relational context. They're a lot more common than the big T traumas, and no less influential. So they often involve violations, not just of personal safety, but of personal autonomy, of dignity. It's a violation of the sense of self and self-worth and of basic trust, where somebody who was allowed in to your circle violated that trust. And so most sexual assaults fall into this category, but also the betrayals that follow sexual abuse and molestation and assault, in which the victim is not believed or cared for, or in many cases ostracized. I've seen that happen quite a bit, where a woman or a client will come forward with an allegation of sexual abuse or sexual assault, and when it's within the family, especially, you know, then okay, well, she can't be invited to Christmas dinners anymore because it's going to make it weird for everybody, right? Because Uncle so-and-so is going to be at the dinner. And so the victim actually ends up being ostracized, or they're not believed, right? He would never do something like that. I've known him my whole life. You know, he's a good guy, right? Like that's often what people say in response to allegations of sexual abuse and sexual assault. And so, of course, the victim is seen as like stirring up trouble, right? And I just want to point out here, I'll go off on a bit of a tangent. 95%, roughly 95% of allegations, reported allegations of sexual abuse, are found to be founded. There is some truth to them, and that means that, you know, we're like, our knee-jerk response is often to not believe, but people who report sexual abuse and sexual offense, and that's only, they're estimating roughly 10% of actual cases are reported. There's no benefit to reporting. It sets people up for an enormous amount of trouble in their lives. So so simply believing, when somebody comes forward and says that something happened, simply believing that it is true or is likely true, can help with that secondary betrayal piece. So I'm going to skip ahead in my notes a little bit here. The only thing that I was gonna, let me go back here for a minute. The only thing I want to add to that is about, I was going to talk about historical trauma, but I think what I want to do is just a little bit on epigenetics. So oftentimes people think about, like, so I work with a lot of residential school survivors, and people often think about intergenerational trauma and the legacy of residential school in terms of learned behaviors. So if you were taken from your parents as a young child and raised more or less in an institution, you would have missed out on the model of responsive parenting that's provided in a family home and in an extended family system. So your internal working knowledge of your parents' roles and appropriate behaviors would be missing. And then you add to that growing up in a harsh and unforgiving, abusive, or oppressive environment with rigid and often arbitrary rules. And then several generations of people learned how to survive and learn coping strategies that really aren't conducive to healthy lifestyles. And then that's modeled in their homes for their children, and the cycle perpetuates. But I think it's important also to understand that our brains and bodies necessarily interface with and are influenced by our social environments. And our DNA contains genes that signal the production of various proteins and enzymes that allow us to adapt to our environmental demands. So depending on what the environment demands from us, through the process of adaptation, certain genes are sort of switched on or switched off to meet the needs of the environment. So I always use an example. Let me see if I can see some of you guys. I always use the example of when early humans began to eat grains, for example. So the digestive system had to adapt in order to break those down and make use of them. And for that to happen, specific enzymes that are needed to be produced, and the human genome was altered as a result. So our DNA was changed in order to produce the enzymes that are necessary to digest grains. Now, the ability to produce those enzymes was passed down to subsequent generations, and the genetic adaptations are often predicated by times of stress. So the need to eat grains was predicated by famine, starvation, right? The deprivation that forced humans to seek safety and survival of alternatives. The same is true for how the human nervous system responds to stress. So sustained exposure to cortisol and adrenaline, sustained hyperarousal of the amygdala, and hypoarousal of the hippocampus, experiencing that stress causes alterations in brain structures, but also in their genome, which is then passed on to subsequent generations. So there's been examples demonstrated in the offspring of Holocaust survivors. Even several generations later, we see heightened sensitivity in the nervous systems of newborns, so larger amygdalas and smaller hippocampuses. So even our youngest generations, who were not even born when, say, the last residential school was closed in 1996, are profoundly affected by the experiences of their ancestors. This is true for non-Indigenous people as well. Whatever your ancestors had to face in order to survive, to bring you into the world as you are now, you have inherited all of the adaptations that they've had to experience or undergo in order to survive their world. So World War II combat veterans, for example, even going back farther than that, right? So babies that are being born today carry the alterations to their genome that their grandparents and great-grandparents had to develop in order to survive. And essentially, these changes have produced nervous systems that are primed for responding to threats in the environment, independent of their own actual experience of threats, big T or little t. So it's not always adaptive in the moment, right? The original nervous system responses of the ancestors was adaptive at the time of suffering. They needed to be hypervigilant, quick to respond, jumpy, and to anticipate hostility from others in order to survive. But just like if you were going to put on some extra heavy clothes and parkas to protect yourself from cold weather in the winter, if you continued to wear that through the intense heat of summer, it could very well kill you, or at the very least, lead to a good deal of suffering. And that's essentially what we see in trauma survivors, right? Is the adaptations that they had to put on in order to survive are no longer adaptive when they're trying to go grocery shopping or develop relationships with new people in their lives. So it's not just about what we learned from our parents and our dysfunctional family systems that creates ongoing problems. Our internal systems that help us to tolerate stress and problem solve in the present have been formed over time. So what I often see in my office, let me just hide everybody again here. What I often see in my office are people wrestling with the shattered assumptions that they're left with long after the physical wounds have healed. Often the event seemed to pull the rug out from under them. So they had ideas, beliefs, and assumptions about how the world works and what people are like, who they are fundamentally as a person, and how they fit into the grand scheme of things. After something awful happens to them, or several awful things have happened, it calls into question everything that they knew to be true. So if God really exists, why would he allow something like this to happen to me? Right? Is it because I'm a bad person and this is my punishment? Thoughts like, I thought the world was safe for me. I thought people could be trusted, especially my family members and the people I allowed into my life as friends. Maybe I can't even trust my own judgment of who is good or bad, or what situations are safe or unsafe. I must be stupid or bad or not worth loving or expendable. And if I am stupid or bad or worthless, and I can't trust myself or my loved ones or strangers or the world to be safe, then why bother trying at anything or seeking growth or exploring beyond the safety that I'm able to create? And in cases where the event is really unspeakable, and what I mean by that is, if I tried to tell somebody what happened or to get help or protection and they didn't believe me, or they shut me down because they couldn't believe it, or if believing what happened would be very inconvenient or life altering, which is often the case, then the damage is twofold. Not only did the person survive this horrible event, but then they were betrayed by trusted loved ones or institutions. And so then the worst thing that's ever happened to them exists outside of a socially validated reality. And the resulting self-referencing beliefs often involve thoughts like, I'm not worth protecting, I don't matter anymore. And so, and in terms of doing therapy with trauma survivors, it's often these questions and these concerns and these self-referencing beliefs that are really limiting their experience and their quality of life. So I'm going to talk a bit. I'm going to skip in my notes. I've skipped ahead on in terms of the physical experience of trauma. Because I think most of you probably know a bit about the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system responses, the fight or flight experience that people have with trauma, the polyvagal theory, right, with the vagus nerve as the brake system. So I'm not going to talk about any of that. If you haven't heard about those things, I encourage you to look up Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory, to look at the work of Bessel van der Kolk. He's written a book called The Body Keeps the Score, which is an excellent book to learn about trauma. And Daniel Siegel, I think that's S-E-I or S-I-E-G-E-L, and his work on the window of tolerance. So those are some recommendations that I make for learning about the physical impacts of trauma. But let me just talk a little bit about the memory impacts. So cortisol, which is it's a hormone that's released when we're under stress. It interferes with the functioning of the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is the structure in the brain that's used for memory consolidation. So there's basically two types of memory. There's explicit and implicit memory, okay? Or you could call it declarative or non-declarative memory. So explicit memory includes semantic and episodic memory. So semantic memory is the meaning of things, right? The knowledge and concept. So if I use a word dog, you know what that means because of your semantic memory, right? Whereas episodic memory or autobiographical memory is our sort of our ongoing narrative of who we are and what happens to us in our lives. So I can tell you the story of what I did last weekend. right? That would be my episodic memory. I could go through, and it's usually fairly linear, it's cohesive, you know, it's sort of step by step. I could tell you the story of, you know, my experience in the 4th grade, right? That's part of my autobiographical memory. And those are things that are fairly conscious. I mean, like, you can sort of go into your memory and pick out, you know, the knowledge and of what words mean, the story of an event that you experience. Now, implicit memory, though, or non-declarative, or sometimes people think of it as unconscious memory, includes our emotional memory. So what it felt like. I don't have words to describe what it felt like to have my son, my firstborn, and to, you know, to give birth to him and to fall in love with him, and right, like there's not words to describe that experience, but there's a felt sense to it, right? And I have the memory of the felt sense, and so that's the emotional conditioning that I'm talking about, the emotional memory. Also in implicit memory is procedural memory, right? Which is our memory of how to do stuff. So I don't have a narrative to account for how I learned to tie my shoes, or for riding a bike. I don't have to talk my way through driving my car. My body remembers how to do those things, and it simply does it. Implicit memories are part of our survival instincts. So traumatic memories are encoded in the same manner that knowing how to tie your shoes or ride a bike or drive a car are remembered. They're deeply embedded in our nervous system. They're almost impossible to forget. I haven't ridden a bicycle in a while, but I bet if I got on one right now, I could probably do it just fine. It's part of our muscle memory, and they're not integrated into the ongoing narrative of who we know ourselves to be or how we make meaning of things and events. Right, so it's separate, it's held separate from that. So that's the impact on memory. Now, a little bit about the physical experience of trauma. So adrenaline, so if cortisol decreases the activity of the hippocampus, which is memory, adrenaline then, which is also released at the time that we're feeling threatened, increases the activity of the amygdala, which is our emotional response mediator. So the fear, terror, rage that's associated with the event is heightened and locked into the emotional and procedural memory of the event. Right, again, you know, like I said, studies of Holocaust survivors and their offsprings have shown decreased size and density of the hippocampus and increased size and density of the amygdala, as well as more active and sensitive superior colliculi and periaqueductal gray area, which are involved in that sort of immediate response to a threat, right? So it bypasses our thinking brain and just moves into our brain stem, sort of these areas of the brain stem that are responsible for simply responding, okay? So it's important to note, right, when we talk, like, I mean, everybody knows about the fight or flight response. These responses become unregulated and stuck because the experience was so shocking or painful, and because it essentially failed to protect them from harm, it can't be integrated or assimilated into the ongoing narrative of our episodic memory. It's not this thing that happened once and it's over now. It's held off, it's fragmented outside of meaning making, but it's never forgotten, and it's frequently relived in the present as emotional and muscle memory, which is beyond conscious thought. So another way of thinking about this, of how the brain is affected, is in terms of the functional networks. So again, thinking about our brain as like, if you think about it as like a symphony, right? So your thinking brain, your emotional brain, and your brain stem or survival brain are like different instruments in a symphony. You know, all, and when somebody's been affected by trauma, you know, it's so they're all kind of playing a different song, right? It's chaos. There's, you know, different volume, different pace, different, right, and even different music that's being played. And so you know, the conductor, which would be the cortex or the thinking brain, essentially shuts down because it's not necessary for responding to the threat. We don't think, we just feel and react. So there's no direction, there's no melody. The limbic system becomes hyper aroused, right? It's going loud and fast, but without really a cohesive plan. And I often think about the brainstem as the percussion, right, of the symphony, because it's sort of, those rhythmic vegetative experiences that we have, right? Heart rate, breathing, sweat glands, pupil dilation, right? Those are this. So if I think about that as the percussion section of our symphony, and it's just doing its own thing, completely disconnected from the rest of the band. And so it's not integrated, right? You can imagine all of the instruments in the symphony, they're playing too loud or too quiet or too fast or too slow or different songs, and it's complete chaos. And so then this fragmented and chaotic response affects how the different systems function. So the salience network is comprised of several structures that help us to be attentive to features in our environments that are really important for us to pay attention to. So for example, if you were driving, your attention is likely spread among several things. There's your speed, the lines on the road, the cars in front of you, beside you, behind you. If the car in front of you stops suddenly, your salience network helps you to coordinate your behavior and emotions, right? So there's fear, a little rush of adrenaline, a sharp intake of breath, you hit the brake, you steer to the side to avoid a collision, you check your rear view to see that if you're about to be rear-ended, and then you get your heart rate back under control. So that's your salience network that's doing all of those things. It coordinates behavior and it regulates emotions. It's directing your attention to the salient events in your environment that you need to pay attention to in order to survive. Your default mode network is constantly monitoring your internal systems. So it mediates memory, emotions, and meaning making to help you to maintain yourself. So self-relevant information such as I am craving chocolate. That's cool because I'm a good person and I deserve to treat myself with good things. That's part of your default mode network. Or my boss just made a comment that I could take several ways. I believe that I'm stupid and unlovable according to my experiences in my life. So obviously she meant to degrade and humiliate me. That would also be part of the default mode network, right? It's the internal focus of attention. Now, it's maintaining the memory of events. And so it's helping us to envision or anticipate what might happen in the future or what might, be unfolding in front of us. And so it impacts, it's being informed by the salience network, but it's also that sort of past, present, future piece that helps us to make meaning about it. And then there's the central executive network, which interfaces with and responds to the social environment by really overseeing operations. So you'll notice in this diagram here where the lit up parts are of the brain, a lot of it is in the prefrontal cortex for the central executive network. It's involved in planning, problem solving, thinking, concentration, judgment, and decision making. And it's linked to the other networks and it's linked to memory. And it has this sort of external focus of attention. It's not internal, but it's external and how to sort of navigate the world. Now, all of these systems, all of these networks are negatively impacted by traumatic events. So the salience network becomes hypersensitive to cues for threat, right? Things in the environment that others might consider quite benign are actually become symbols of danger. So this could be places, it could be objects, it could be people, either specific or general qualities of people, right? So it could be, let's say, an uncle or a man who has the same or similar hair color as the uncle, or facial features or build, or some other perpetrator, or it could be generalized to all men. It could be a smell, such as a particular cologne or food. It could be a facial expression, right? A frown, or even a smile, depending on how the perpetrator approached the victim. One of the things that I find challenging to work through in therapy with people is when kindness is a trigger, because their perpetrator approached them with kindness and empathy and used that as a method of getting at them. So that becomes quite challenging when people are triggered by that. The default mode network uses skewed and incomplete memories to make meaning of self-referencing judgments in order to engage in the present and to plan for the future. So if I'm a traumatized person and I have memories that tell me that what I want isn't relevant, what I need is unimportant, and what I desire is unattainable, then those are the self-referencing beliefs that form the foundation of my initiative, right? That's what feeds my capacity for creativity and curiosity and ambition. And then the central executive network, which is impacted by and integrated with the other networks, is also not functioning ideally. So attention and concentration are impaired because I'm scanning the environment for threats, right? Thinking, planning, and problem solving are all impacted by my negative beliefs about myself, about what I can do and what I deserve. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time explaining this slide. What I am going to do is I have a PDF version of this PowerPoint, which I will send to Annette, and she can distribute that to everybody so that you can have a look at this. But essentially what this is describing here is developmental trauma. So while any traumatic event at any time can result in pervasive symptoms that impact functioning, what appears to have the deepest impact imprinted within us was what is experienced in childhood. And what makes childhood trauma, particularly early childhood trauma, so devastating is that it disrupts the developing nervous system and the sense of self at a primary level. And of course, remember that children are vulnerable because they are dependent on adults for their survival. Specifically, they're dependent on the emotional and physical support of their adults. And they also lack choice and power in most things. So the violation of choice and power, or the corruption and abuse of power to harm another person, is at the heart of interpersonal trauma, of that little t trauma. And of course, our first experiences in life involve connecting to our caregivers. And so I'm not going to go through the whole piece on attachment, which, you know, if you're interested, again, I recommend looking at Dan Siegel's work on attachment. But basically what this slide sort of demonstrates is that traumatic experiences that happen during critical periods of brain development can negatively impact the physical structure and function of the brain as well. So, you know, the brainstem is developing most saliently during the sort of pre-verbal stages, right? So birth to 3 years. And so anything involving the brainstem, so that would include, you know, sleep, sensory processing, muscle tone coordination, you know, body flashbacks can be impacted by pre-verbal trauma or anything traumatic happening in the first 3 years of life. The limbic system is developing most from preschool to puberty, right? And so that's our emotional brain. And so trauma during that time shows up in relationships with others. And adults who were harmed during this part of their childhood often have a very difficult time navigating social encounters and relationships with friends, coworkers, bosses, partners, even casual encounters. They're often recreating traumatic experiences. And so there's a lot of, as you can see from the list there, there's a lot of ways that people are impacted when they've experienced a traumatic event or several traumatic events during that time frame. And then the cortical brain, or the cortex, is developing most through adolescence. And so when people experience traumatic events during adolescence, they have problems with self-assessment, attention, concentration, thinking, planning, right? Being able to follow through, being organized, problem solving, right? And then there's this sort of self-hate, self-blame, self-loathing, self-doubt. And it creates a person who doesn't try, doesn't have enough experience with mastery to feel capable of success. So behaviorally, what you see with somebody who's experienced trauma. So fragmentation, what it looks like in behavior, is like people who've been traumatized can't form a coherent or cohesive picture of themselves. It would be like asking someone, well, what do you want to eat for dinner? You know what? I don't know. Well, what do you like? I don't know. Well, what kind of music do you like? Yeah, I'm not really sure. right? You know, and that extends to so many parts of people's lives. It makes it very difficult for them. They lack a firm sense of who they are, of what they want, or where they want to be. And so this makes developing goals and following through very challenging, especially when there was interference with cortical development. So planning, organizing, decision making, when those are all fragmented, it makes it really tough to do goal development and then following through. Conversations can be very difficult and frustrating. People with trauma can become angry or frustrated or aggressive very easily. They're primed for a fight and they're anticipating hostility. I think it's important to note that the most adaptive response to a threat for human beings is aggression and hostility. Anyone who's ever been in a bar fight knows, like, you've got 8 seconds to finish that thing, and you better be the one on top, otherwise you're not going to walk away from it, right? So when we're threatened, it's actually very adaptive for us to respond with aggression, hostility, and violence, because you're more likely to survive that way. And anger might have been needed at one time to protect the person. It's just not adaptive in a lot of other settings. They become agitated, they can't sit still. This is often confused with ADHD, right? But it's actually a neurological adaptation to danger. Very hypersensitive to nonverbal forms of communication. So your frown, a tone of voice, there's perceived judgment there. An eye roll could be like the worst thing of the day. And then also, because of difficulties with attention and concentration, it might be hard to sit still and do work. There's difficulty following instructions because the brain is too busy looking for the possible underlying threats. Problems with authority. Remember, authority figures are often the sources of traumatic events and sources of pain. You have to consider that children who've been abused are often the victims of somebody who's been in charge of them at some point. So when we, people who are in positions of authority, use an authoritarian style or try to control them or try to limit their options so they have to do things our way, we're essentially behaving like they're perpetrators. And then there's those negative, like when I say negative symptoms, I mean it's sort of the absence of something. It's not, as opposed to an additive, which is positive. So there's a lack of energy, lack of initiative, and a flatness, kind of zoning out. So I'm going to skip that one, but let's just talk quickly about what to do. Okay, so first and foremost, when we are working with somebody who has experienced a traumatic event and we are promoting healing for them, the first thing we want to do is create safety. Okay, so we want to provide real, authentic opportunities for power and choice. Right, we want to look at the physical safety of the environment, right? The space, the building itself. Is that a trigger? I work with people who attended residential school or day school. Going into a school or an institution is triggering in and of itself because of the building. We want to consider relational safety. How safe is it for your clients to actually be around you? You know, how safe is it for them to actually encounter you in your physical space? Resistance, you want to remember too, resistance is always going to be the response to oppression. So people are always going to seek safety. When you see or experience resistance from clients, rather than asking what the heck is wrong with them, you might ask, like, how might they be feeling oppressed or disempowered or coerced in this moment? And then reframe their behaviors as attempts to be safe. Right? Physically safe, emotionally safe, or relationally safe. And then we just want to adjust our expectations. In light of what you know about trauma, can you expect normal functional behavior and engagement, right? What's more likely? How can we adjust to them rather than expecting them to fit into our box? We want to promote neural integration. So we want to encourage our clients to be aware of thoughts and feelings and what's happening in the body. We want to encourage left brain and right brain activities, right? Anything that's bilateral stimulation. So stimulating both sides of the body at the same time. Activities and tasks that engage both sides. So creativity and intuition mixed with logic and analytical reasoning. We want to instill hope, right? We want to scaffold opportunities for mastery. So you know, you think about basic training in the military, they kind of tear you down and build you back up, right? You don't know anything about anything. Let's start with making your bed, right? Once you've mastered that, then we'll move on to shining your shoes. Once you've mastered that, then we'll move on to cleaning a weapon, right? And taking it apart and putting it back together. Once you've mastered that, then we move on to maneuvers. And so we take people from nothing to a place where they could actually engage in combat, right? And do that well. Now, I'm not suggesting boot camp or anything, but whatever it is, wherever the person is at, they can get to a better place, right? And so we want to scaffold or provide opportunities for mastery and celebrate the small victories. We want to bury the words resistant and unmotivated, right? Just take this, remove them from your lexicon. Just think brain, something's happening in the brain here. And then we want to just be compassionate with ourselves, right? You don't know what you don't know. You need to know your own triggers and do your own work, right? And so oftentimes we are being triggered by the clients themselves. And so it's important. I always encourage helpers, see a counselor, right? Consult with friends, journal, become more self-aware and self-attuned, because the healthier you are mentally, physically, emotionally, and spiritually, the better equipped you are to model the behaviors that you want to see from your clients. So try to remember in the moment when they're triggering you and behaving in a way that makes you want to, you know, push them away or impose some consequence to satisfy your sense of justice, that these are traumatized, harmed, broken, mistreated people. Sometimes we can simply help people who need help because they need help, and we don't have to turn it into a life lesson where they feel guilty or shamed, or even, you know, we expect some gratitude for that kind of